In the digital age, the art of storytelling has been lost in a sea of quick pitches aimed at grabbing our attention for another click. Few sages remain who hold the power to intertwine words in long format with such fluency their reader becomes part of their journey, eager to walk hand in hand down the path of enlightenment. Rowan Jacobsen is such an author. His cadence and script brings wonder to subjects in a manner that evokes emotion and demands the page be turned. Today on Cocina Pirata Podcast, Rowan joins me to discuss the evolving landscape of literature and the issues we face maintaining homeostasis in the mechanized world.
Contra la muerte nosotros demandamos vida. Contra el silencio exigimos la palabra y el respeto. Contra el olvido, la memoria. Contra la humillación y el desprecio, la dignidad. Contra la opresión, la rebeldía. Contra la esclavitud, la libertad. Contra la imposición, la democracia. Y contra el crimen, la justicia.
What have you been up to through COVID? What's been going on?
COVID's been interesting. So I haven't left Vermont in, 18 months, except for a couple quick trips to Maine to do a story about wild blueberry wine.
Okay.
It's a pretty cool thing that's just starting to blow up in Maine a little bit. But that's it. Other than that, I've been hunkered down in Vermont. So tons of writing. Turns out pandemics are really good for writing time. But definitely I miss the whole go out to new places and have new experiences part of the job.
Yeah. You're born and raised in Vermont, right?
Yeah, born in St. Johnsbury, actually.
Really?
So Northeast Kingdom kid.
Yeah, Northeast Kingdom. Beautiful. I don't know if I haven't spent much time in St. Johnsbury. Obviously,
I haven't either since I was born.
Did you go to high school in St. Johnsbury?
No, I went to elementary school in Plainfield. So
okay.
Plainfield, Marshfield area.
Yeah. Awesome. And what in college? Did you go to college? Did you leave Vermont for college?
So my by the time I was 11, my parents, they had 3 small boys. We were living in the hippie house that my dad had built in the woods in Vermont, like classic Vermont story.
Yeah.
The house didn't have a basement. The pipes froze every winter. So by the time I was 11, I was the oldest of 3. My parents were done with Vermont winter. So they moved the whole family to Florida in a vast overcompensation.
Yeah.
So then 11 to 21, I was in Florida.
Okay,
so,
cool.
Total culture shock.
Where in Florida?
DeLand, Florida, which is a
no
tiny
idea
town. Central Florida, kind of between Daytona Beach and the shadow of the Great Mouse, so
okay.
Cultural wasteland, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Are your parents from Vermont originally also?
No, my dad was from Maryland. My mom was New York City. So Goddard College was what brought them up here. And I don't know if you know Goddard. It's
I've heard the name. I don't know much about it.
So it's the iconic hippie college from the 1960s. Anything goes, anything went. My dad taught there. My mom was a student there. After she graduated, they met raised their kids in a total hippie environment.
What was that? What was being raised like that for you? How did you feel about growing up? I mean, you said the pipes froze. You guys were kind of in a shack in the woods. How did you feel about growing up that way?
I thought everybody grew up that way. When you're a kid, whatever you do is normal. So I thought that was totally normal. I really liked Vermont. So I definitely did not want to go to Florida.
Yeah.
I fought as much as I played all the power cards an 11-year-old can play. Didn't help at all. And then, like I said, it was definitely a completely different culture when I got to Florida. So that was when I suddenly realized we were all freaks back in Vermont. I didn't know.
It's funny because my perspective of growing up in Vermont was I grew up in Essex Junction, so I guess it was a little bit more city, and we were a middle class family, lower middle class family. My mom, single, with a stepdad, but whatever. That's a long story. But my perspective was I guess I was growing up not really in the woods. When I got old enough to get a car and go to the mountains and go snowboarding, I was getting away more. But my perspective always of Vermont was I need to get the fuck out of here. This place is too small. And then and then I find the older that I get, the more I'm drawn back to places like this.
Yeah.
So did you always feel a pull back to Vermont when you moved to Florida?
I did. By the time I got out of college, I knew I wanted to head farther north. I missed the seasons, basically.
Yeah.
But I'd been in Florida long enough to believe that nobody could human beings could not survive north of like North Carolina, maybe. So actually, went to grad school in North Carolina because that to me that was like going really far north, like a big risk. And then after that, 2-3 years there, then I was like, all right, back to Vermont.
Yeah. And I guess that's where your love, a lot of American Terroir was obviously like the first book that I read of yours that really made a shift for me. But then I started to read about the books that you've written on the coast. Is Florida about the coast? Is Florida where you fell in love with the concept of the ocean and kind of its symbiosis with the land?
I think so. Yeah. Like obviously growing up in Vermont, my experience with the ocean were super limited, but Florida, even though a lot of Florida is pretty horrible, but you can actually find some pretty amazing places there. You still can, where the tourists aren't. And so I did spend a bunch of time in the relatively wild parts of the Florida coast and inland Florida too. And they're both pretty cool. So yeah, there was some really good coastal experiences in Florida that first got me thinking about that. And there's wild oysters to eat in Florida, stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, Florida, I guess Florida's a pretty good example of how culture can destroy the perception of a place.
Totally.
No? Like
totally.
If Florida is a really cool, wild, beautiful, full of nature peninsula, essentially, and I think that everybody just perceives it as a place where things go to die, where people go to die, unless you're in Miami, right?
Right. And I mean, it is where people go to die, but and that's, it's true for everywhere. In my experience is that the perception of a place that has been imparted to you by media and by people who don't live there, every time you go to one of those places and you're there long enough to sink in a little bit, you're like, oh, this isn't what I've heard at all. Like there's all these different things here that I didn't know about.
Yeah. How do you feel? Do you feel any of that about Vermont? I guess I don't know what the perception of the world is about Vermont at this point, because if I speak, like I've lived in Denver, I've lived in California and Los Angeles, I told you, Lake Tahoe. And I think what a lot of people pictured Vermont as, for me, was like a hippie escape that wasn't really like culturally forward yet, or was like 10 to 15 years behind. How do you feel? And I guess I'll make the precursor that now being here, I see that there is some drive to move forward and catch up. Like, how do you feel the perception versus the reality in Vermont is? Or like the outside perception versus the reality, because you travel a lot and I'm sure you talk to people about where you live. And
yeah, I mean, Vermont is super progressive, right?
Yeah.
Like the most progressive state, or like sort of like jockeys with Hawaii to be the most progressive state. And so that's its reputation, I think, is, organic food, and there's still a little hippie vibe, happy small towns, and super liberal voters, which is true. But I'm sure you know this, if you spend a bunch of time here, is that is actually a pretty thin veneer. Like, I live in Calais, which is a town that reliably votes crazy left on everything.
Yeah.
But I walk 200 yards up my road and I'm in Woodbury and there's Trump signs everywhere. So I feel like there's a very visible, very progressive sort of like Vermont middle class, classic Vermont, slightly hippie middle class. And then there's a part of Vermont that doesn't get seen very much by the outside world, which is quite different from that. And it's fascinating to me. And you go up to the Northeast Kingdom, you see a lot of it.
Yeah.
But it's definitely more scrappy and more like down on its luck.
It's also, it's funny to me. The divide's always been funny to me because you have like two completely different sets of human beings who essentially are interested in the same thing. Like the really aged farmers, for example, want their land and they want their freedom on their land. And the hippies want essentially the same thing, but somewhere in the middle. And I guess this is a greater conversation about culture in general and how we choose to place our bet on the future, who with we choose to place our bet on the future. But it's funny that this divide is happening. It is super harsh here, no? Like you said, that was the perfect explanation, a thin veneer. It is really. And I think, so moving into food, I guess also, it seems to me, at least since I've been here, and maybe you know more because you live here, I don't know how much exploration you've done into the farming practices here, or like the food movement here, but it seems there is a movement in the right direction. But to me, it seems, as with everywhere in the world, again, the veneer is thin, and there is a lot of pictures being painted of a really organic or regenerative movement. But my fear is that it's always just marketing.
Yeah, I would say it's not just marketing. I mean, there is a thriving food system in Vermont. Vermont's the model for the country in terms of how, like, the percent of the local food that's consumed. I'm sure it's higher here than anywhere else. But local food is super expensive compared to, what you're going to get at Walmart or Dollar General. So yeah, that divide is still here, where, the communities that I'm a part of wouldn't think of getting their food anywhere except from a farmer's market, a farm stand, or, the co-op. But they spend a lot of money on food, and they can afford to do that just barely usually.
Yeah.
And then most of the state is not shopping there still, even though we're the model, and is, spending much less on food because that's all they can afford.
Yeah, it's really, one of the super interesting things about being in Mexico is really seeing what you're speaking about, like this local food being more expensive, picture being painted in a really crazy way. Because actually, what we work on in the nonprofit is kind of more, and like I said, I hate to call it a nonprofit, but that's really, for lack of a better term, I guess, what we're doing. We're just working to create an idea, a theory about how we can connect an autonomous network of distribution for food, because the middleman is obviously the most expensive part of any process, but somehow the industrialized food system has figured out a way to grow at an incredibly cheap rate. So for example, in Puerto Escondido, if you go to the mercado, you can get a bunch of spinach for 10 pesos. And if you go to the local organic farm, they'll sell you the same thing for 10 pesos. But the question then remains, like, you can still get it at the same price, but then the question remains, like, how the fuck did they get this spinach here for 10 pesos? When we understand the journey that it's made. So,
well, I was going to ask you about Oaxaca, because I wondered if maybe that was somewhat removed from the pressure of industrial agriculture that we face here.
So I think that the things that no one pays attention to are the things that I've started to really pay attention to over the past, decade of my life, is like understanding what the commoditization of food, how that all works, how the structure works. And in Mexico, for example, what's happened for years, it's always the battle in Mexico from the people against the government has always been agrarian, because it was a sovereign food I hate to call it a country, because this whole fucking continent that we live on was, I always hear like 100, however many hundreds of years ago, Mexico was half of the United States. None of that is true. It was all just one big piece of land, and there was no invisible line separating us all. But in that area, and as it progressed and, was separated, it was pretty sovereign. And a lot of the small farmers were able to subside on the crops that they grew to feed their family, and then just go and sell a little bit in the mercado or trade to get whatever else it is that they need. The Mexican Revolution was essentially battling what had happened when industrialization was starting and the land was taken, not so much that the land was taken away, but that commoditization of food made things so incredibly cheap that those farmers who were subsiding couldn't sell their products anymore in the market. And so they had to leave their land and go start working in things like the logging industry or the oil industry or any other industry in order to feed their family. And then them not being there, they couldn't take care of their land, so they couldn't take care of the crops.
Yeah. So same pattern as elsewhere.
Yeah. And so in Mexico, it's even crazier, because the majority of the tourism that comes there, like if you go, have you spent time in Mexico?
Yeah, a little bit.
Have you gone to like a local mercado, like a market? Mm-hmm. It looks beautiful, right?
Totally.
all that shit's from Puebla. All that shit is grown by the majority of it. If you look for a little old lady like in a corner selling her wares, that's the woman you want to buy shit from. And they're usually there on like Saturday and Sundays. But the majority of that shit is coming from industrialized farms, which NAFTA helped. I don't know how much you know about NAFTA, but NAFTA was the Zapatista movement essentially said like, this is the second coming of our death, because all of the things they had fought for, that Emiliano Zapata had fought for in the Mexican Revolution, essentially had been like walked back slowly, and then that was the cutting point.
The night NAFTA was passed in like 93, maybe, I think it was.
94.
94. So like 2 miles from here down the road, I went to a talk by David Brower of Sierra Club. And he was supposed to talk about Sierra Club stuff, but he just went off on NAFTA. And at that point, NAFTA was getting super positive press everywhere. It's like, this is great. He went completely off script for a full hour, just free associating, explaining why NAFTA was a disaster.
Yeah.
He was thinking about it for the environmental movement, but it was also for independent farmers. And
the crazy thing about those kind of decisions that are made by people, like, we believe that we live in a democracy to some extent, right? Like, that's what everybody believes. I guess we don't really live
just
in a
don't
democracy.
look too closely.
Yeah, exactly. And so, anyways, that decision was made not by us, by somebody else, and it was sold to us in the United States as a bill that, was going to help. Well, it was sold to everybody like it was going to help everyone, but really in the United States, the capitalist machine understood what it was going to do for us: cheap labor, cheap land, and a bunch of fucking products coming in for super cheap. And so we didn't really realize in the process that, like, the destruction, for example, ecologically, that it would have on us. And we didn't really care about what was going to happen to anybody else. And I think that that's one of the lessons that we have to learn from those things. And hopefully we will, but I don't know, one of the things, do you pay much attention to commodity crops like soy and corn? Do you see like anything that's going on? Have you done any research on what's happening in those markets?
Somewhat, yeah.
And they're all subsidized, essentially. Like what I've
totally. So you can't compete.
Yeah,
and it's big business.
Yeah. And I've found that we're paying for it on both ends of the coin, essentially.
Yeah,
you're paying through taxes for the subsidy, and then you're paying for it on the plate when it's fed to a cow, or
you're paying on your healthcare costs eventually. Yeah, I mean, there's no free lunch in a sense, but and it's interesting, like the whole system that has evolved, the food system that has evolved. It didn't have to be. It was arbitrary. Like, you can kind of set the dials. This goes back to like the farmers no longer being able to feed themselves. That's a decision made by, financiers about where to set the dials, where to set the numbers and all this stuff. Like, if you think about it in terms of calories or whatever, rather than like dollars, we could totally have a system where farmers could profitably grow their own food. It's a choice, but everybody has to buy in. So
I'm super interested in that we're walking down this path, because I also believe that that's true, and I'm interested in your perspective as someone who's looked at food on a global scale. You've done a lot of research on foodways, so I'm interested in like how you see that working from where we are now to like what would be the pathway.
Well, that's the problem. How do you go back? Like so many things. Going back, the system works until you break the system, and then rebuilding the system is really tough. Like, none of us are independent anymore. And if we suddenly, if the grid goes down and suddenly we have to become independent, we probably can't do it. Like, but 200 years ago, 150 years ago, everyone was good to go,
Yeah.
But the pieces of the system that would support that are no longer there. So, and I think, we need to figure out how to break the sort of like the global transport system of food, and not just food, other things too, food, energy. But how do you get off, how do you kick the heroin without having vicious withdrawal symptoms?
Yeah, there's not really rehab for I guess that's one of the things that
agriculture.
Yeah, there's not really a rehab for nature except for itself. And I thought that like maybe COVID would dip its hands into that process a little bit, but from my perspective, I think it just fortified what was already fortified a few at the top. No,
same thing. I thought this will be interesting, right? Like maybe we all need to like relearn a few skills here, but no, it fortified the Amazons of the world, and all the big infrastructure pieces got stronger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't personally like, I always when I have this conversation with people, I always like to say like, I don't think there's a problem consuming things. Look, I drive a Jeep, which is not the most fuel efficient car in the world. I don't think that that's the problem though. I think that we just can't have nice things. I think we've just grown into a society that we can't meter our own use. We are addicts, no? And so, and in reality, it does start on a consumer level. No, this movement has to start on a consumer level. I don't think that, and I think again, asking a government that's clearly tiered to make money isn't going to work.
Yeah.
What are the things that you see here in Vermont that you think are moving in the right direction, or that you've seen around the world that you think are like maybe calls to a new future?
Vermont is a good model in many ways, at least for the country. For Western society, Vermont serves as a good model in a few ways, I think. I mean, there's people ask, how did like this Vermont food sort of like miracle happen? Like just, regular middle-class people in Vermont are just super interested in where their food came from. They're willing to pay for really high-quality food, which allows Vermont farmers to grow really interesting things and to make a living doing it. And so people always ask, like, how did that happen? Like, what was the beginning of that process to get an entire, like, local culture that invested in local food? I actually think it did start with the like Back to the Land and the hippies. Being interested in nature, already being interested in that connection, like to health, and then it goes beyond health. It's more sort of like a spiritual source. Like that's really what people were seeking in Vermont. Starting in the 40s, the Back to the Land was actually way pre-hippie, but it was sort of a spiritual calling that. And food eventually played into that. Everyone eventually realized how important food was to that. And so I think and what that means, and this goes back to American terroir a little bit, is that it's all about how you place value on things. And food, it's not just if it tastes good. Like, it's not just like, oh, this is a really good wine, I'm going to pay $50 a bottle for it or whatever. It's that it's beyond the taste. It's the spiritual connection. You're getting more than just calories and a great experience on your palate.
Yeah.
And people are willing to pay for that, but but only once they sort of have like wrapped their heads around it.
Yeah. So now that's a good segue, because you're talking about placing value on things, and I'm interested in the work that you've done on truffles, which
Speaking of value,
so
the ultimate example of the absurdity of it, and maybe the interesting part of it.
So this is something that, like, again, that I do in my work. I try to find. Obviously, we're pretty far away from endemic species of crops being viable for use or even existing anymore. But that's what I try to do. I try to find like what grows in this area. So when I work with a farmer, I say, the way chefs work normally is we think of an idea, or, historically chefs think of an idea, and then they think about how to bring all these products in from around the world. And I try to place what I've begun probably 8 years ago to work in reverse. I just talk to the farmer. I say, grow whatever is good to grow, and then I'll work with it. So this is the way I think we should be growing. Truffles, on the other hand, have somehow made this really deep impact. I, for one, I guess because I lived in Los Angeles and there was truffle fries on every fucking menu, I got a bit, which I understand most of the time doesn't really contain truffle.
Yeah,
but
no truffle.
But I'm interested in what you found out and what your perspective is now. Like, do you think, if you can give me like a brief history on, I know nothing about truffles. I've paid
Nobody
attention to them in the past 10 years. I know that pigs hunt them, and now they have some dogs, I think, that hunt them, but I'm not entirely sure. What's like the history, like a brief overview of the history of how it started, and then maybe like flash forward a little bit, like where did this culture come from, and what the process is of even getting the shit here and why it costs so much money.
Yeah, and it does cost an fucking insane amount of money. Like a white truffle is like $3,000 a pound for something that's gone in like 5 minutes or 5 seconds, on your plate. But yeah, so really, I think you got to start with nature, because truffles are basically like a multi-million year, market test in what drives mammals crazy. So they're related to mushrooms, but they stay under the surface. They never pop up like a mushroom does. But they're the fruiting body of a fungus, and the fungus has symbiotic relationship with trees. So it lives along the roots of the trees and gives the trees water and minerals in exchange for sugar that the trees give to the fungus.
Sorry, not to introduce. So is it part of the mycelium?
Yes. So the mycelium, it is symbiotic with the trees. And when the mycelium wants to reproduce, when it mates with another mycelium and produces a truffle. So a truffle is just a spore-filled ball. But the weird thing about truffles is they decided to stay underground, right? They'll be anywhere from like 2 inches to a foot underground. But they still need to get that ball somewhere else, right? So they'll make more truffles to spread around. So their way of spreading is to smell insanely good to passing mammals, and smell so strong that a mammal with a good nose will know it's there, just like wandering through the forest, be like, oh, there's something crazy smelling 6 inches down in the dirt, and be willing to like dig down and get it. So they have to like really incentivize the like squirrels and pigs and whatever with a bonkers smell that you're not going to get anywhere else. And they've kind of gone like the drug route. So it's not like they're not delicious. There's no sugar. They're not sweet. They have like sex pheromones in them and like drug pheromones and just like crazy like gasoline smells and stuff. And like it's nothing that a human designer, like a human perfumer would ever come up with to have like a tantalizing scent, but it works.
Yeah.
Like it works. They're not targeting humans. They're targeting flying squirrels, pigs, deer, mice, but it works on us too. We totally like go for it. And we're willing to pay like drug-like prices for it.
Yeah.
So then they're always there. Animals would eat them. Peasants would like plow them up on their plow, the prongs of their plow when they were clearing a field, and be like, damn, what are these stinky potatoes? These things are gross. But then some people, typically the French and the Italians were like, maybe they're not so gross, These are in fact pretty awesome. So like by 16th, 17th centuries, it was like super, super high priced, valuable rarity, because it's pretty hard to find them, that would just go to royalty. And yes, it was pigs originally, because like farmers would literally, like their pigs would be going crazy for something in the woods, and they'd be like, what are you guys all after there? And they'd find them. So first they would then like go out with their pig to find the truffles. They'd train the pig, but the pigs love to eat the truffles. So that was always a problem. There's always stories about these like 9-fingered truffle hunters, because they're always like trying to wrestle the truffle out of their pig's mouth, and the pig doesn't want to let it go. So they actually like all switched over to dogs starting in the 1800s, 1700s.
Okay, so it's been a while.
Nobody uses pigs anymore, except apparently Nicolas Cage in his new movie where he plays a truffle hunter with a truffle pig in Oregon.
No way, that's coming out.
Just came out. Yeah. Totally wrong, but hey, if Nicolas Cage wants to promote truffles, that's great. But anyway, yeah. So it's all dogs, and that's what fascinates me, and why I wanted to do the book was because it's this entire industry, this like $1 billion industry, totally dependent on dogs. Without dogs, you can't find any of them. So the dogs are like these rock stars.
Wild.
And without them, the whole thing falls apart.
That's crazy. And so is there a definitive starting point that you found for truffles?
Starting point in
terms of history, it becoming a commodity, I guess. Like where, like have you kind of pinpointed where this whole...
The Romans and Greeks were into them, but those were probably different truffles. Those were desert truffles, which are a whole different. They don't smell that great. Like the classic European truffles, it was really 1600s, 1700s.
And have they always been extremely expensive? Was there a point, like, did you pinpoint? Was there like a point in time where they became expensive, or is the cost just based on the labor? Always.
They were. They're one of those classic things that peasants would literally throw away, and rich people would pay ridiculous amounts of money for it at the same time. And then eventually the peasants would realize that they shouldn't stop throwing these things away and like sell them up the chain. But it was always completely, black market or gray market, just like hand to hand traveling through. Like collectors would travel around, get the truffles, sell them to the next person, and then eventually they'd make their way to restaurants in big cities.
It's one of the craziest things to me because for example, in Los Angeles, there's this group of guys called Truffle Brothers who are like fucking dudes with an Italian accent, which like apparently if you have an Italian accent, you're like, the
Italians took over the whole truffle thing.
Yeah. And so, but the thing that's interesting about it is that you can get truffles that are $3,000 a pound and you can get truffles that are like $5 a pound from them. You can get these ones that like don't really smell, but they look, and then you just put truffle oil on the plate. I guess the disconnect for me has always been like, for sure there's no way to grow them, right? Like this can't be like, can you propagate them? Is there a farming system for truffles?
Oh yeah, for the black ones. The white ones, no one can figure out how to propagate.
So is the black ones the ones that like, is that the cheap ones are probably coming from a farming system?
But so there's the good black ones, the classic French ones, which sell for like $800 a pound.
Yeah.
But then there's another species of truffle. That's the winter truffle. The summer truffle, which looks like the winter truffle, but has no smell whatsoever, but it looks right. And it's the one that sells for cheap. And then there's Chinese truffles that also resemble those black truffles that are even cheaper. So the cheap truffles, they look right. They have no smell.
Yeah.
But the price is right. So yeah, often, like you say, what chefs would do, and they didn't know better. They would get those truffles and then use chemical truffle oil, which is synthetic, has no truffle in it. It's just made in a lab. But it's cheap, to like deliver sort of like a very cartoonish version of the truffle thing.
Yeah.
At a price that a restaurant could afford to go with. But it's totally different than the smell you get from the pricey ones.
How do you feel about truffles today on your plate?
I love the good. I love the white one. It really is like a drug-like experience, I think, in the best way. But it's fairly subtle. So the prices are absurd. Like there's no way it's worth it.
Yeah.
But if you have a dog who knows its shit, they're free.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's what I think is interesting. And what I'm seeing out there is the beginning of a grassroots realization that you can kind of do an end run around this ridiculous faux luxury, like outdated system that basically the Italians built and have been like purveying for decades. That, just a secretive thing, and we have the only good ones, and you have to be in Piedmont to get the good ones. And so that's why it's worth paying this price. Turns out truffles grow all over the world, and you can train your dog to find them in a month, 2 months. And then you have like the most fun thing to do with your dog, and you can get this incredible ingredient from the forest. And it's a really fun hunt. So I think truffles are going to have their like grassroots moment.
There seems to be a resurgence of fungus in general right now.
Of fungus is a good phrase.
Yeah, it's great now. In general right now, both like in the psychedelic realm and in just the naturalist, like looking around the woods realm. Because I remember, mushrooms in general are pretty expensive. Like good wild mushrooms in general are really expensive. And I think my first awakening was like going to, when I visited some friends in Austria, we went in the mountains and picked chanterelle mushrooms, which at the time I was cooking for like $32 a pound. We were buying them for at the restaurant. We just walked into the woods and we came back with like 3 kilos of chanterelle mushrooms. And I was like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Why are we paying this? And I think it's just because it goes back to this, what I believe is kind of our major problem in the food system is that we just got comfortable not doing the work.
Totally, the disconnect.
Yeah. And like being okay with whatever that person, like we're just going to work harder. This goes back to that whole conversation about like the Mexican Revolution and like land, like not being able to subsistence farm and being okay with working fucking 60 or 70 hours a week so you can afford white truffles on your plate or chanterelle mushrooms on your plate, as opposed to just like living in symbiosis with nature. I guess that's kind of this movement that's happened in Vermont a little bit is going back there.
Vermont's gone back there. And by the way, chanterelles are everywhere right now. If you have a chance to get out in the woods.
I know I need a spot. I missed out. We were driving through Denver, and a friend of mine, Alex Seidel, who's a really incredible chef from Denver, he was like, he hit me up. We had a bunch of shit going on, but he hit me up and he's like, yo, we're taking off tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. to go mushroom hunting. And I hadn't been for like a decade. And I was like, fuck, I'm not going to go. And this guy's going to give me like his spot, you know? Like, I feel like, like everybody's got their own spot, and he invited me on this incredible journey, and we had already had plans, so I couldn't go. But that's the other cool thing about mushrooms is that, I don't know if you know like Paul Stamets. Have you heard of Paul Stamets? Yeah. The mushroom community now, and in general, a lot of the science has been like amateur scientists, no? Like it's been a lot of amateur scientists discovering all of these things about mushrooms of the new species, which is really cool. And it's linked to our life, which we don't really understand, makes it even stranger that there's not a lot of scientific research about mushrooms.
Yeah, and it's happening. And as you say, they're having a moment now. And I think like fungal intelligence has a lot to teach us. It's like a whole different approach to the world than plants or animals tend to use, and it's very much about playing with other creatures and striking relationships with other creatures. They're like masters of mutualism. They're just always like looking to be like, okay, what does this organism need, and what can I get from it in return, or trick it into giving me, and then I think as the science gets more sophisticated, they're realizing what a huge role fungi play in all these systems.
Yeah, I don't know if you know any, I align myself a bit with anarchism. I don't know if you know who Peter Kropotkin is.
No.
He wrote a book called Mutual Aid, which was like kind of the beginning of this idea of like how people can coexist. And it was based on nature, like how nature works in mutual aid and showing us. I think that if he was around and he saw this, he obviously mushrooms weren't on the forefront then, but from now what I know, actually that's mycelium is like the best example in the world of how we should actually live, kind of building communities that feed each other. No,
totally. They're like the ultimate networkers, like literally, right? They create networks. And but it's interesting. Like there was this whole sort of like explosion a couple of years ago of interest in the Wood Wide Web. I don't know if you followed that at all. So it turns out like all the trees in a forest are connected underground through systems of fungi, of mycelia, and they share nutrients and they share information. So when that was first discovered, everyone's like, "Wow, it's a hippie commune! Like everyone's working for each other. It's like happy go lucky sharing." And then some other scientists came along and looked at it a little closer, and they're like, "Actually, it's more like a marketplace where the mycelial networks are connected to all these trees." But they're only giving the trees what they need if they get something else in return. And if this tree gives more, then they'll cut this tree out of the network and go here. So it was a little bit more like mafia, a little bit less like communism.
Yeah, that's wild, actually. I just watched this, what is it called? Fantastic Fungi.
Yeah.
Which is another, one of the things that I think, we were having a conversation before we started recording earlier about this access to information and the way we receive information now. I even refuse to read a book digitally because I feel like holding it in your hands makes you commit to the process of reading it and understanding the information. And so even watching that Fantastic Fungi, I think it's like a great way to jump off. But now we have all of these like armchair environmentalists who have watched some documentaries, and we don't get enough of the information out. Like, for example, what you just explained, because what's explained in that movie is they just communicate with everything and they just feed everybody everything. And so I think that, I think that I hope a deeper understanding can come. I wanted to ask you this question actually based on that is how does the sale of books work nowadays? Is like all of your
that's what the whole publishing industry is asking itself too.
Yeah, like are you selling? Does your stuff sell digital? Do you sell hard copies anymore? Are people holding on to information in that way?
Oh yeah, hard copies are still dominant over electronic copies, but obviously a lot less so than they used to be. But people. It's a little bit like vinyl. People have realized, just like you were saying, that there's a value in the physical book that doesn't exist in the digital version. And I think, yeah, it's easy to forget that all these digital simulacrums of whatever are not exactly the same. Like you think they're the same, and then you realize it's really only a very narrow way of absorbing the experience, and there's all these other elements of it, like tactile and the way time is different when you were sitting with a physical book, and distractions that you don't have, and that was all part of the experience. So people seem to be realizing, even I think not consciously, but they're understanding that there's a value in that physical experience, and even like the way your body takes it in, that's different. And that's true for, I think, quite a few things.
Do you find yourself writing differently or producing content differently now than, for example, when you wrote Geography of Oysters or American Terroir? Do you find yourself producing content differently based on the way we consume information now? Does that even come into your mind when you're producing content?
Sometimes. It depends on the outlet. If it's for a physical book, then no, I think I'm still thinking and pretty much how I always did. But if I'm doing an article and I know it's something that's just going to be online, then I think, yeah, sometimes it does change for that reason. And certainly people's attention span is shorter for online reading. They can't read as many words on a screen for whatever reason, whether it's because other things are always one click away, or just because the eye struggles to take in the words when they're pixels. But you have to shorten everything for online.
I know. I find myself I'm a victim. I'm a proponent of ignorance sometimes, in the sense that I do the way I consume news. I try not to pay attention to news, because I find news to be, like, right now it's almost toxic the way we consume it, and also how quickly information changes. And so, but what I do is I have a Google Pixel, and I like slide over to the Google News feed, and I like scroll through it, and I'll be like, oh, interesting article, and I'll read like the first 2 paragraphs, and I'll be like, yeah, I get the idea, and close it. And then I'll like go to my wife, and I'll be like, hey, did you hear about da da da? And she'll be like, no, tell me more. And I'll be like,
that's all I know.
Fuck, I can't.
Yeah.
And I feel like we're all in that stage. I've tried as much as possible to revert. I mean, I was a voracious reader when I was a child. It was kind of my escape from the world that I was living in. And I had a real connection with books. And then in my mid-20s, I was like, fuck book. Not really like fuck books, but I was like out exploring the world. So I didn't really like carry that with me. And then I began reading a lot more, into my late 20s. And now I'm 35 now. I try to read like, a book every 2 weeks is what I try to push through. But I even find myself struggling. I find myself struggling to like get through the pages without picking my phone up to find information about what's inside that book.
Totally. And every writer I know struggles too with that. Like, and we're the ones writing the friggin' books. And it's still hard for us to push through a novel, which it never used to be. It's, you realize it's like a muscle like anything else. And none of us are in like marathon condition anymore.
No.
It's just weird though, like, because you never used to think of it as like something you had to work at, just like somebody who runs marathons all the time doesn't think about it. But it's weird that we're all losing that. And what does that mean in terms of the way we understand things?
Do you think do you think that also some of that has to do with the style of writing people have taken? For example, there's certain books that I read that I feel like are punchy. Like they're trying to get facts out, and they're great authors. I like Paul Greenberg, for example, is a great author. But I find when it gets into what I really love about your writing is your writing to me is almost like a poem. Like you're very fluid in the way you write and like you have a real connection with what you're doing. And there is some information there, but there's a lot in between that information that tells the story. And so, do you feel like the onus is on the writer to bring people back to the pages, or do you feel that we've just lost this way of consuming that we can't like it?
Yeah. I mean, the onus is definitely on the writer, but the writer can't do it alone. Like, if I definitely, when I'm writing, I'm very cognizant that the reader could throw my book down and go do something else at any moment. So I definitely try to, I'm always singing for myself. Like you said, it's got to be a good story, no matter what. Like, no matter how virtuous it is, it's got to be a good read, a good page turner. So I always try to choose my subjects partly based on that. Like, oh, this is something I would want to read about, not because, even if I didn't want to like learn about anything, this is a good entertaining, good entertaining story. And then once you got the entertaining story, there can be information in there. Like, people take in information very, much better when it's part of a narrative than if it's just like laid out for its own sake. And not enough writers do that, perhaps. Like, you didn't used to, you go back and you look at some of those older books, they're a slog. Like, you could the writer just assumed that he or she had the reader's attention for as long as they wanted, right? Nobody was going anywhere because they were on a boat for like 4 weeks or whatever. So
they didn't need to check if their Amazon delivery was coming on time.
They were stuck with this book. And that's obviously not the case anymore. So yeah, you got to be somewhat punchy. Paul's a great example. I think Paul's in Vermont right now. Actually.
Really?
Yeah.
I'll have to try to send him a message.
I just got an email from him. He was in the Adirondacks and he's coming through Vermont right now.
I love the work that dude does. I think it's really incredible. And I think it's really important. I think that the ocean is also, I will say that the Shadows of the Gulf, mm-hmm. That book actually opened my eyes quite a bit to the relationship between the ecosystem of the ocean and in the land, the way you describe everything that happens there in the Mississippi Delta, like the way those things have shaken out.
And that was the goal. That was my worst selling book, though. Turns out nobody wants to know about that.
Which is wild. Because I think that the reason why, for example, I don't find that enough people even give a fuck about the ocean. I don't think that they have any idea, like the mushrooms, that the entire world is working in symbiosis. Before we came, like, this fed that and that fed this. Like, there was this incredible symbiotic relationship. No, there was homeostasis before we came, or before modernization came, and we thought that we could like edit this 1,000,000-year-old process to be better or more effective. And so I think that the unfortunate thing that's happening to the ocean, you can see it everywhere. We live in Puerto Escondido. It's really interesting because when it rains really fucking hard, the entire bay, it's a steep hill. And the mountains are very steep. And when it rains, you can see the bay just fill with brown. And then you understand, okay, everything is flushing into the ocean. And then what happens once it gets in the ocean? What are the mollusks all the way up to the fish? But no one looks at things like that. And I think that we don't speak about that enough. The ocean, obviously, that's an entire another conversation that we could go down the rabbit hole into. But one of the things I'm interested in is, like, how did you go from, because I understand a bit, like the geography of oysters was essentially a dictionary to some extent, right? Or like a user's guide, we'll say.
Totally. Yeah. It was meant to be, I had gotten really into oysters, right? And so I looked for a guidebook and didn't exist. So I just literally wrote the book that I wanted to exist,
And did that research somehow spark the interest? I wonder how you as a writer got to the point where, for example, you wanted to find out why things taste good, why the word terroir could be applied to food, or what it meant to you, and like how you find yourself on that subject.
Right. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where I think what people are actually looking for in food has a lot more to do than just the taste. food is the main way that we still connect to nature, to the non-human world. And so it's a great path for people to take into the non-human world to sort of deepen that relationship, which, as we've been talking about, has pretty much been broken, when you're getting corn and soybeans through the industrial system from some farm that you don't even know exists and where there's almost no people working on it. You're not going to find a path to nature through that system. But food always was like the way that we interacted with the non-human world most intimately, super intimately. And so it can be a way for people to find their way back to that. And that's what I just noticed with oysters. Like, you've seen people, they go to the coast, they eat some oysters on the half shell, and they're having this like reverent experience because they're connecting to the ocean. They can taste the ocean. They're living off the ocean for that moment. And the passion that you see people get in those moments, it's not just because they've got this like salty, high umami thing in their mouth. It's because they're like back to the sea, back to where it all began in a way.
On that, have you read it's called Fishing, the History of, I can't remember the exact title, but anyways, in this book, Fishing, it kind of explains, it's the history of fishing and the history of our interaction more so with the ocean. And one of the statements that it makes is that one of the theories is that because we were single cell organisms that crawled upon the shore before we were hunter gatherers, we were actually tidewater foragers and gatherers. And one of the beliefs is the reason we're drawn to the coast is because it's kind of like a coming home. And the other is that, this connection. Well, I mean, that's essentially it. The connection that we have to the ocean. That's why we find ourselves like vacationing on the coast. That's why we find ourselves really enchanted by things like oysters and eating fish. And it's a subconscious. Have you read anything about this, or do you understand anything about this connection that we have with the ocean on kind of like a spiritual level or a subconscious level that's been ingrained through evolution?
Totally. I actually did a book on that called The Living Shore.
That's where I read this.
Yeah.
Did you write it? Did you write about that, or was it in fish? I think it's in Fishing too. They talk about it.
Yeah, no, a lot of people have talked about this. We clearly like.
I've read The Living Shore.
The colonization of the world was mostly coastal.
Yeah.
But you see, and that was probably like a really great environment for human beings.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've noticed as a chef that we turn all our food into like the exact salt level of like the ocean.
Yeah. This is super funny. So this is did you write about that in Living Shore? I read The Living Shore.
I can't remember.
And I'll send you the book. Fishing is really interesting too, because they talk about actually like how we evolved fishing from like tide pools and like beating catfish over the head, like throwing catfish on the shore and hitting them over the head. That was like the first way we were fishing. And then, of course, like, through native culture, which you did write about in The Living Shore, there's
salmon
a lot of, and there's also a lot of proof about shellfish, right?
Yeah.
Like a lot of, it was in the Pacific Northwest that you did some of this, right?
Yeah, the clam gardens that they have out there.
Yeah. So
they go back thousands of years.
So one of the evolutions that I went through in cooking was actually like, why the fuck do we always use salt and sugar so fervently, and why is it like what you hear people when you taste something, if you're a cook and a chef comes and tastes something, he said, oh, it needs salt, oh, it needs sugar, right? Yeah. And so I started studying neurogastronomy. So I started studying the way our brain communicates to us when we eat food. And what I realized, or what I found out through research, and this is the cooking that I do now, actually, we only use salt and sugar when it's scientifically necessary. I almost never use sugar. I actually use honey in place of sugar if I have to, because the sugar industry is also salt and sugar were commodities. Not everybody had salt and sugar, but essentially that 90% of what we perceive as taste is actually smell. It's retronasal in our olfactory sensors. And the other 10% is on our tongue. So that's salt, sweet, savory, bitter, sour, which don't have any smells. They're actually all just tastes on our tongue.
Right.
And so at least what I speculate and what I theorize is that like we were using a trick that we didn't even realize that we were using. Salt, for example, as you know, like we didn't evolve with receptors to hold sodium compounds in our body, so we flush them out naturally, and we only need about 4 grams of salt a day. But if we put salt on something, the reaction in your head is I need more, because our body thinks that it needs more sodium. And with sugar, obviously, it's a carbohydrate reaction that's happening in your mind, which makes it so. My theory is that, like, I mean, you could put salt on a pile of shit and someone would probably eat it, right? If you put sufficient salt on it. So,
and that's what the fast food industry does every day.
yeah, exactly. And actually, another great book is called Taste, and the woman who wrote this book called Taste, she was a food scientist, and she explains this whole process. I think that maybe opening people's eyes not only to people don't want to hear that shit. When I speak to people, they really don't want to hear that
Chefs
shit.
don't want to hear that shit.
When I go into chefs, like I get invited to cook places very infrequently, because a lot of times I'm there prepping with the cooks and I'm having these conversations with the cooks, and they're like, oh shit. And also that, like, sodium compounds, for example, exist in nature. MSG is naturally occurring in almost every plant. And so, you know, in my restaurant, if we're cooking beans, normally you would put salt in them. We dehydrate tomatoes and we use tomato powder as our sodium compound.
That sounds awesome, actually.
Because there's a shitload of MSG.
Gets people into me,
yeah, exactly. And so I think that that's the next step. And I feel like there's a disconnect. I feel that there's a disconnect between people like yourself who write and who are, I think you're an anthropologist to some extent, right? Like that's kind of what you
have to be. Like every good writer should be partly an anthropologist, I think.
And I think that every chef should be metered on his ability to understand that he's an anthropologist and also communicate that message. And I think there's a disconnect between people like you who are writing these books and the consumers who find them. I told you I give American Terroir like to food writers. I've given it to food writers, and they're like, this shit changed my perception of the way we eat. Also, have you do some writing for in food magazines or in the food realm?
I write for a bunch of the food magazines and science magazines. And
how do you perceive the food? How do you perceive food writing now? How long have you been doing food writing, for example? Like in magazines?
That's a good question. So I started working as an editor for The Art of Eating.
Oh, okay.
You know The Art of Eating? Actually, there's a poster right in there from Art of Eating, I noticed. So working with Ed Bear at The Art of Eating shortly after I moved back to Vermont. So this would have been it's probably around early 2000s. And so Ed was like the first person that I had met who was going deep on terroir and doing it not just about wine, but about other things too. So he was ahead of the curve on all that. And so then it was after that I started sort of like seeing the world through terroir colored lenses. You know? But that was the beginning. So Art of Eating, early 2000s.
And now flash forward 20 years, do you see a shift? I feel like they're in the older days, and maybe even older than maybe even the 90s or the 80s, there was like much more critique about food from food writers. And now it's kind of like this happy place where you can write about anything and everything is good. Do you see that happening? And do you think it's a detriment to food in general, the way food is being written about?
Probably. I mean, it shouldn't be. One thing I struggle with, and maybe you do too, because I think like food writers, I don't know about other food writers, but me, and I know chefs, they're so close to food for so long that they start thinking about it really differently. And I could get a little put off by the way food gets fetishized about.
Yes.
And like being obsessively writing about a restaurant or a particular food or something, or even like a bottle of wine, like that's not the role food was meant to have in a life or a culture or on the table. Like, you should pay attention to it, but you shouldn't like stalk it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think fetishizing is a great word to use. And I think that that's probably why we're in the place we are in consuming food, because what we've done, and I believe, like my personal belief, again, another reason why it's like I'm this kind of black sheep of the community is that I think that it's our responsibility. I think if we're providers of sustenance, it's our responsibility to fully understand what we're providing and not give people what they want. And I think that that's why we've gone down such a dark path, is because, you know, now chefs are taking the role that, like you said, McDonald's is playing. Like, they're putting fucking, for example, truffles on everything. They're putting butter on everything. They're putting, you know, there's someone wrote a cookbook called Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. And that's apparently like the 3 principles we should be cooking by. And I just don't believe that that's true. And then food writing now, like, I mean, I have a lot of people coming to my restaurant from significant magazines to write. And when I meet with these people, they have no fucking idea what they just go around and eat at places.
Right.
And so if you just go around and get doted on all the time, of course you're living like a king. And if we look back historically, you know, thousands of years ago, those were the people who were taking advantage of things and probably were responsible for spurring us in the wrong direction.
And you're still missing out on the really fun experience because, as you know, when you make the food and eat the food, it's a much richer experience than if the food just appears out of nowhere and you eat it, you know?
Yeah, and also I feel that, so for example, in my tasting menu concept Pirata, we don't put it, like, you come in, it's a 10-course tasting menu. We do, like, as I said, we only use salt and sugar when it's scientifically necessary, which is like fermentation, or, you know, pretty much just fermentation is all I use it for now, because I don't do a lot of high heat cooking. I like to use things in their natural form as much as possible. But I also don't put a menu on the table. And I don't explain, the servers don't explain any of the dishes when you kind of sign up. This is.
Are you using a lot of unfamiliar ingredients, like stuff coming from Oaxaca that people
not
don't
really
know?
Because none of it would. I mean, it's only unfamiliar because it's only unfamiliar because we don't eat that shit anymore. You know what I mean? It's only unfamiliar because we choose to only eat the things that we believe are really good, but they're very humble ingredients. So in reality, not really. But what I found is, in the beginning, so it's 10 courses. So the first 3 courses, people are like, the fuck, there's no fucking salt in this. By course 4 or 5, because you aren't being explained what you're eating, you're forced to focus on what you're eating. We only seat in tables of 4 and 2. We don't push tables together. If you got a big party that wants to come in, we'll split you up between a few tables. But the idea, and there's only one light over each table, and you're forced to really focus on what you're eating, which I think is, you know, what you're talking about when you're saying the cooking and the involvement and like the emotion that's involved with it is lost completely when we just consume what we want. And when a customer comes in and says, I want this with this, this, and this, I don't want it the way you're preparing it. They're missing out on an entire, all of that shit that was put into the idealization. Then I was just talking with a chef that I cooked with here in Essex about this the other day. We make exceptions as chefs. We make exceptions as consumers, and we make exceptions more so as chefs to say, like, the customer's always right. I don't believe that shit. I don't believe I believe that the customer 99.9% of the time is probably wrong, and that 0.1% we probably know, if we're conscious, that we fucked up and it's our responsibility and we'll take responsibility for it. But I think that one of the ways we walk back the errors of the past is just being a conscious consumer and going into a place. It's like, an easy way to paint the picture is like, if instead of you writing a book, you like reached out to a bunch of people and you were like, how do you think I should write this book? Or how do you want to, or for each individual person, you wrote the book a specific way. It just doesn't make sense to me. And so I don't know. I think that you hit the nail on the head when you said, like, we just lost this community. Like, it really is a community effort, food, no?
You know who's really good about this is the wine importer Terry Thies, who kind of specializes in like German wines and grower champagne. He talks about how surprise is really important. And if you're always getting exactly like what you're saying you want, like, you're never going to be surprised. And so you're actually always going to have a slightly underwhelming experience because what you're getting is just a reflection of yourself, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And then and then everything becomes homogenized. Like food essentially has become homogenized,
right.
you know? Like,
yeah.
And there's these things that we expect to see on a menu for it. Like restaurateurs, I think that one of the major shifts, I do think that restaurants play a huge role in the collapse of the food system, because I believe that they are the ones, now that it's become cool, are dictating the trends for food. And instead of taking the opportunity to educate themselves, they see a dollar opportunity and they say, if you go to any neighborhood, or if you go to any big city and you go to like 5 restaurants, each in different neighborhoods that are all modern American, let's call them, they're all going to have the same shit on the menu. Just imagine it another way. What I like to say is it's the cover band syndrome. We're in the cover band syndrome, right, where we're all chasing, like, when you go into a restaurant, how many restaurants have you been to in the last 5 to 10 years where you felt like what you were eating was truly original and not just a recreation of something else?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And I think that's what we're, it's like when you read, like, for example, Eater, it's like the best cheeseburger, the best taco, the best pasta bolognese, like,
right,
these
as if there was a best.
Yeah, as if there was a best, right? And then this brings up a whole nother fucking, the world's 50 best, all of these things that perpetuate this problem. And so, I mean, I think that I don't know. Do you see any writers now that you really feel are activists in a sense? I feel that your writing is in some sense like silent activism, or at least it's like educating.
Yes. It's supposed to be quiet activism.
Yeah. Do you see any other writers or new writers or young writers that are coming out that are doing something similar?
I was having this conversation with a friend of mine who's an organic farmer recently, actually. Like, who is sort of like the next generation of writers, both environmental writers and sort of food activism writers? And I don't know. Paul Greenberg is actually a good person on the sort of food activist front, also in sort of a slightly less quiet way, but also an indirect way. But then, Paul's my age, so he's not the next generation.
Yeah.
I'm really curious. I don't have a good answer for that, but I've been very curious to see if there is like a new generation. Like, it probably won't be books. I would assume that books hold on the culture is going to be a little too marginal to really serve an activist. Although sometimes books still, even if not that many people read a book, they still sort of echo out into the culture because the right people read the book.
Yeah. I know that you do go and do go and speak quite often.
I used to.
Not
until COVID.
Before COVID. When you were going out and speaking, were you seeing that the reception is like there is this kind of this drive to continue moving forward the ideals that people like you and Paul Greenberg and writers of the past have put forward?
Totally. Like, I speak every now and then to a college audience, and they are super enthusiastic and super interested. So it does definitely seem like that, that 20-year-old cohort right now is looking for something different and is they're primed for it. And they know a hell of a lot more than I did when I was 20, but they still don't necessarily know where to put their energies,
Yeah, and I think it's because, that's another interesting thing is like everybody is really emotionally charged right now and they don't even know what the fuck they're emotionally charged about. I try to say, at least for me, I've started doing some writing because it's a way for me to express myself, because I'm definitely loud when I need to be about what I think is right and wrong. And so it's an outlet for me to kind of Medium is a great way for me to, I just type shit. I probably need an editor to some extent. Like, I send shit to my mom and I'm like, I don't know where to put periods and commas. Like, I didn't pay attention to that part. But I think it does take, so when I do these things, I try to view the world as like, right now my world is this space. you know? I think that when people take on the task of writing or thinking about something, a lot of times they're thinking about how they can solve the entire world's problems through their prose. And I think that it's important to look at things under a globe, like not get lost in the ether of like how which is interesting in your writing, because for example, American Terroir was a big fucking undertaking, no? Like you went a lot of different places, but I feel like you found like a microcosm in each place. How do you find yourself, like when you, for example, when you take on truffle, on the truffle book, and you know that there's a myriad of information out there, how do you hone down on what it is you're seeking, and how do you like keep the noise out and really find yourself?
Well, so with that one, it certainly, like, part of the reason I thought that would make a good subject is because it kind of forces you to focus. Like, if it ain't about truffles, it ain't going in the book. Even though, you know, you talk about truffles, you can end up talking about all kinds of things like mycorrhizal relationships and human underground relationships, and just like perception, sensory perception of the world, and how that works and why it's important. But I think definitely you have to be narrow focused when you're doing a book or an article or whatever. You can always sort of like talk about everything, but that's like the classic mistake, to be like, oh, this has to include all these things. It's better to, you know, you're just giving somebody a few brushstrokes.
Yeah.
Like like I always feel like the classic mistake that writers often make is to try to micro control the reader by like putting in like 4 pages of description of the room, as if that is going to make the reader picture that room more accurately somehow. When really the reader's doing all the work. All you can do is make a few suggestions for what the reader should do with their own mind. So, you know, it's like Impressionism. Like, here are your brushstrokes, Matisse, right?
Yeah.
You do the rest.
on that same tip, then, do you fear ever when you're writing? Does failure or acceptance come into your mind at all? I find that failure is actually a place to learn from. But is that something that you fear when you write? Does that dictate your writing, or do you kind of just say like, I'm writing whatever the fuck I want to write, and however it comes out is how it's going to come out?
Well, I have to, you know, in terms of making a living, you can't have too many failures.
Yeah.
Because it is, you know, it's buy the copy.
Yeah, exactly.
But actually, that's it's an interesting point. So my first book was oysters, geography of oysters, did great.
Yeah.
Like, I'd fortunately stumbled on the perfect subject at the right time for the culture. My second book was Fruitless Fall, about honeybees. And again, like, just nailed the zeitgeist. Everyone wanted to learn about the subject just right when the book came out. So I had 2 hits right off the bat. So I think I learned the wrong lesson. I thought the lesson was just write about whatever you're interested in, write about it really well, and the rest will take care of it. And then my next couple of books were much sort of quieter, smaller market books on coastal ecology. Did not sell well. Got great reviews, but didn't sell well at all. So I realized, oh, wait, the lesson is not just write about what you're obsessed in and do it well. Make sure other people are obsessed with that same subject, you know? So, like, too many more failures, I would have gotten the next book contract.
Yeah.
But, so I definitely need to be cognizant, make sure I'm not just like, it's not just an egotistical thing for me. Like, I'm in service to this potential readership out there.
But those two, so are those 2 books, Shadows of the Gulf and Living Shore?
Yeah.
Those, but here's the thing. Those are also 2 very important pieces of literature, I think. And so how do you if you take that into mind, like, how would you have if you knew that ahead of time, how would you have shifted the prose of those books to be more digestible? Or how would you even enter that conversation? Because they are important conversations to have.
Right, they are. And how do you, but you got to fold it into something that is broad enough, that you have a broad enough audience for. Or you can, you know, get a professorship and write more academic books that have important things to say, but find a smaller readership, and you're not making your living.
So what do you feel
doing
like were the failures of those books?
Just failure to find a large audience. Which
Yeah.
It's only a failure in that I need to sell enough copies to like pay my mortgage and be able to write the next book. But they actually, both those books definitely have propagated, intellectually in various minds. Like they definitely struck a chord with people who are immersed in those subjects. So, and they've helped get people more interested in those subjects. So I think they have worked in terms of the activist level.
Yeah.
They just didn't work commercially. And now we're right back to capitalism, right where we started with the food system.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I understand that for sure. I understand, like, I guess that how I've found my peace with capitalism or needing to make money is like, I know there's certain things. So one of the things that I do is like, I do consulting on restaurant projects. I have a very strict guideline by which I choose to work in those things. And it's a contract that's made ahead of time. But I understand like finding the ebb and flow of like making money and living and of course now having a child, like having to take care of that child.
Yeah.
But I do think it's important to push some. Do you find yourself revisiting subjects like that, or do you find yourself getting to a point in your career where you will just write whatever the fuck you want? Is there a retirement ahead that you can just like go on a binge of writing things that might not be perceived well or are not perceived well but digested in the same fashion?
It's I think definitely, I can see getting to a point where I can. Now that I have a strong reputation in the publishing world, I can probably afford to like keep pissing off more people with each book, which is different. Like you can be very commercially successful pissing off people.
Yeah.
But yeah, so probably take more chances. Even the truffle book is taking more chances in a sense. It's a weird book,
Yeah, I'm excited to see it.
But it's kind of like the triage. Like you can divide your potential book subjects into like maybe 3 categories, right? There's ones that would do well, but really aren't about anything the world needs to hear about. There's the ones that are about things the world needs to hear about, but won't do well. But then there's a big chunk in the middle, which are things that'd be really interesting to write about and are important to write about, and you think there's an audience for it. So there's lots to pick in that middle chunk. So that seems like the most productive place to concentrate one's energies.
I'm going to ask you I'm going to go to left field real quick because I told you I really like to discuss theory. I want to know what your theory on life is. Like how old are you now?
53, as of a few days ago.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Mine's August 28th. My wife's is August 21st.
You're still Leo, August 28th?
The cusp. Leo, Virgo cusp, apparently. Yeah. So I've got a little bit of both. But what is through the 53 years from going, I mean, you lived probably more of a Vermont childhood than I did. Like I told you, I grew up in kind of a Essex Junction. There was IBM money and all that shit floating around me. But like from, living in the cabin to Florida, back to Vermont, like what do you think is the purpose? I know that's a tough question, but what do you think the purpose, or like how do you think that what's your theory on the way that we should live, or the way that you want to live?
So one thing I noticed more and more is that people don't actually know what makes them happy. They get it wrong all the time. They think that the fancy cars can make them happy, or even like, the rich family life is going to make them happy. It doesn't have to be like, commercial things, but, and often it's not what makes them happy. Like, and it takes people a long time to realize and I don't know, for me, and I think it's true for a lot of other people, just being fully immersed in that moment, whatever it is what makes people happy. So like, people come over to your house for dinner, like, can I help cook? And you're like, no. But they're actually happier if they get to help cook. And, I can be out on a camping trip. It's raining like hell. I'm kind of miserable, but I only realize after the fact, it's actually a great experience. Like I was totally like immersed, and I'm feeling really like full about it later. Even though at the time I was like, oh fuck, it's really wet. So I like more and more I pick my projects to be things that I'm going to be totally immersed in, even if it's not comfortable. Because that's what makes you like go to sleep at the end of the day feeling satisfied.
And do you believe that this, like, I guess that I perceived as a, when I was young, and I think that a lot of people, and maybe this is a like the capitalist mentality slipping into the subconscious, is that struggle is necessary in order to form who you are and what your future is. Do you believe that struggle is necessary, or do you believe that there's like a way to live symbiotically from day one, and that the struggle is a construct that we've built through the need for things, like you said?
Yeah. What I find for me is that learning is necessary. Like I'm only happy when I'm learning something new, even if that learning is just exploring, a new place. So it doesn't have to be learning a new language or something, and learning is always struggle, right? Like I am often, I like to write about subjects I don't know anything about. So I'm often the dumbest guy in the room. Like I'm the guy asking the three pros super stupid questions from their perspective. So it's often humbling and like exhausting sometimes. But so that's a kind of struggle, but that's really, really fulfilling.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess we find that in nature as well. Like nothing beautiful really exists without a little bit of pain, right?
Totally. That's why camping is fun, because like you're down to nothing. You're like, oh God, thank God I have this can opener. That's awesome. And like my goal is just to get this fire made and get dinner made, and I'm calling that success.
Yeah, and that is kind of the benchmark of success. And going back to something that you said before, like if the fucking lights turn off tomorrow, everybody's fucked.
Everybody's fucked.
I've made it a point in my life to learn a little bit of everything. You know what I mean? I think that the other thing is that a lot of people spend so much of their life, especially in the past maybe 50 years, what we've been taught is like specialize in one thing, nothing else matters. Like die on the edge of your sword for one specific thing. And I think that the more we accept and look at nature, it's like just learning how to be engineers of life is important, and knowing when something breaks, how to fix it, not just physically, but also consciously. And for that reason, I guess struggle is necessary. Being a student of life. Like, do you think that you'll ever stop learning?
No, for sure. It's what's fun. It what draws me. But why? Like, why do you need to learn? Like, sometimes I wonder, maybe that it's just another type of addiction,
Yeah, but I guess when you stop learning, you stop. I mean, my grandfather is a great example of a person who's just there. There's certain people who just reach a certain age and they're like, "Fuck it, I know everything." Or like, you want to know my least favorite thing that and it's not really like, of course, it's like the youngster inside of me wanting to shake the tree a little bit, but like that at a certain age, people check out and they stop.
Totally.
They stop moving forward. That's why our system is broken. That's why humanity is broken, is because we believe in theories of the past. We're constant. You know what I really see? There's no more fucking theorists. I think when Noam Chomsky dies, we might all be we might all be doomed. But that's the other thing, like one of the great things I like. I think that your books also play on theory quite a bit. No,
yeah.
And I think that just trying to spark some learning and questioning. No, like drawing questions to the table. People don't want to answer questions anymore.
No, and they check out, especially, so I'm 53 and I definitely see it happening with my, my cohorts. They check out and they become convinced that they're right about everything. Like, so the key thing is just to always be super suspicious of your own bullshit, right?
Yeah.
Like every day, nothing.
Yeah. Sweet. Well, I think that's a pretty good. I think
grim part to end on.
I think it's a good place to end, though, and hopefully we'll do this again in person. I really appreciate you joining me today and sitting down. Again, I think that for anybody listening to this podcast, if you haven't read Rowan's work, I think it's very important. I think that you do a great service, not only to food, but on a wider spectrum, the planet. And I'm excited to see what else you got coming up. Let me know, when's the book dropping? Where can we find it? Where can we find more information about you? Instagram, I don't think you have, but all of the other resources are.
But yeah, book drops October 5th. You can find it everywhere. And I'm rowanjacobsen.com.
And what's the name of the book? Sorry.
Trufflehound.
Trufflehound. Awesome. Thank you so much, brother. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. You got a knack for this.